It's December 31st. Welcome to our New Year's special, A Year in Review. I'm Virginia Fay.
I'm Sarah Renahan.
I'm Melissa Lee.
And I'm Arti Patel.
And we're your hosts for today. Now to our political analyst, Arti Patel.
On March 4th, Abraham Lincoln, the new 16th president, made his inaugural speech. Because the northern states here in America are manufacturing based and use raw materials to create different goods, he abolished slavery. However, in order to maintain the plantations of the labor-intensive crops like cotton in the South, slaves are still being used. Conflicts broke out between the North and the South because of their differing views and the South not wanting Lincoln as president. This ultimately led to many southern states seceding and forming the Confederate States of America, led by Jefferson Davis. The first state to break off from the Union was South Carolina. Shortly after this, the states of Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana also broke off. For this reason, Lincoln's address was directed towards the people of the South. Also in his speech, Lincoln explained to the people the policies that he intended to implement. He promised that they would never be the first to attack. If anyone rebelled against the United States, they would be met with force. He ended his address showing how he hoped to prevent any future conflict.
All these things escalated into war, which our military expert Melissa Lee will now discuss.
In the beginning of the Civil War, the Union had already formed a plan to suppress the Confederacy. Proposed by General-in-Chief Winfield Scott, the Anaconda Plan had two main features: a blockade of all southern ports and the deployment of 60,000 troops down the Mississippi River. The blockade would cut the South off from the rest of the world and from foreign aid, and strangle their resources, while the soldiers would cut right through the middle of the Confederacy and weaken the rebellion. Though many ports were closed off, Scott's plan was never fully realized. Scott had underestimated the nation's thirst for war and the South's dedication to the cause. The nation didn't want to wait for Scott's Anaconda Plan to squeeze the South to military death. Instead, the Union forces under the leadership of Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant fought a two-front war in Virginia and Tennessee. Also, the Union forces followed Major General William T. Sherman on a march through Georgia. The combined efforts of the Union forces effectively accomplished what the Anaconda Plan intended, only using much more aggressive means. In early 1861, tension was building between the Union and the Confederate States of America. President Lincoln's order to resupply the Union fort on Charleston Harbor, Fort Sumner, despite the South's threat of attack, resulted in the bombardment of the fort, which I reported on live earlier this year. We are here live in Charleston Harbor in Charleston, South Carolina, today on April 13, 1861. Standing behind me is Fort Sumner, where the first battle of the Civil War has just taken place. Just days ago, on April 10th, the conflict between the Union and the Confederacy came to a head when Brigadier General Beauregard, the commander of the Provisional Confederate Forces here at Charleston, demanded the surrender of Fort Sumner, a Union garrison. The Union fort, under the command of Major Anderson, refused to comply with the Confederates' demand. On April 12th, the Confederate forces opened fire on the fort and fired the first shots of the Civil War. The fort's supply of ammunition was not sufficient, and there were no fuses for the explosives, so the Union forces were only able to fire solid rounds at the Confederates. The Columbiads and 8-inch howitzers mounted on the top tier of the fort were not able to be utilized effectively, so Major Anderson opted to rely on the casemated guns on the lower tier of the fort. Due to this lack of armament and ammunition, the Union forces stationed at the fort were not able to fight back effectively and were forced to surrender just hours ago today at 2:30 p.m. The Confederate States of America have just won the first battle of the Civil War. With the battle at Fort Sumner, the Civil War began bloodlessly, since there were no casualties on either side during the battle, only 2 Union deaths during the surrender ceremony on April 14th. After the bombardment of Fort Sumner, widespread support emerged from both the North and the South for more military action. This demand for military action led to the first Battle of Bull Run on July 21st, which I had the opportunity to give live coverage of. This is Melissa Lee reporting live from Prince William County, Virginia, where fighting has broken out between the Union Army and the Confederates. This is one of the first major conflicts that we have seen so far in what is now being called the Civil War. The unseasoned Union force was under public pressure to march against the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, since a successful seizure of Richmond would have led to a quick Union victory. Although General McDowell, a Union brigadier general, was uneasy about his untested troops and his lack of command experience, he commenced the march to Virginia on the advice of President Lincoln. And so, this hot and sultry morning, a Union force of 28,000 men marching towards Richmond met a Confederate force of 33,000 men commanded by General Beauregard. which had just left from the southern base Manassas. In the beginning of the battle, all of the Confederate forces were on the retreat except for the brigade under General Jackson, now called General Stonewall Jackson for holding his ground. Confederate reinforcements arrived a few hours ago and turned the tables. The Union forces were then on the retreat. Although we still have information streaming in, our current estimated casualty toll is 2,900 dead, wounded, and missing. Now, just under 5 hours since the first shot, most of the fighting has died down. The majority of the Union forces have already retreated back to Washington. It's beginning to look like a Southern victory here. The Southern victory at the First Battle of Bull Run proved that the Civil War was not going to be a one-sided war for either side. The battle also gave the Confederacy a sense of victory and improved troop morale. For the North, the battle only resulted in a thirst for revenge.
And now for a public service announcement, brought to you by your president.
I have suspended the writ of habeas corpus. The government now has no need for a reason or cause for detaining anyone, and people are no longer entitled to a fair trial before they are thrown into jail. You wouldn't want to end up like the people who were thrown into jail because they insulted me, so watch what you say or you'll never see the light of day.
Both the Union and the Confederacy had their advantages and disadvantages in the first year of the war. The Union has a huge advantage with its industrial-based economy, which allows them unlimited supplies of guns and ammunition. The Union's economy is gradually rising as the need for weapons becomes greater. The Union lacks manpower compared to the South because of all of its slaves. While the South had slaves in Robert E. Lee, that will not help them in their increasing struggle to support its war. The South has had and is having problem clothing and feeding their armies. They also have had a shortage of horses and their armies dwindling compared to the North. Because of the South's agricultural-based economy and the lack of crops being grown because of the war's path that has destroyed a lot of them, it is hard to feed their army. The South's economy had a lot of impact on their recent decline due to the lack of industry because most of their capital was invested in slaves and their land. Their lack of industry lacked them in weapons. The only means of raising money was through printing currency. This becomes a problem as the South lacks gold and causes huge inflation as their money's value is based on the public's belief of winning the war. Both sides of the war had to deal with enormous debts. One way that the Union handled it was coming up with the income tax. The Union realized that it needed $320 million over the next year in order to support the war. At first, a bill was passed for a 3% tax only applied to people that earned at least $800 a year. It was not enforced though. So Congress later passed a 3% tax on incomes between $600 and $10,000 and a 5% tax on higher incomes. The Confederacy would then try to implement a similar plan in order to support their war efforts.
Oh gosh.